This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the fourth Tuesday of every month throughout 2023, Mountain and Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions here in the American West. I'm very excited about this year-long series, and I greatly appreciate the Nature Conservancy's generous support. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in Colorado and around the world, visit www.nature.org/Colorado. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Paige Lewis. Paige is the Deputy State Director and Director of Conservation Programs for the Nature Conservancy in Colorado. In this role, she serves as the chapter's Chief Conservation Officer and is responsible for leading the development of innovative, large-scale, and entrepreneurial solutions to the challenges facing people and nature in Colorado and around the world. Paige brings a unique skill set that combines big-picture thinking with tangible, on-the-ground execution. Her work involves creating ambitious, large-scale strategies, while also ensuring that the TNC team has the resources, communication, and support to accomplish its goals. Over the course of this 2023 podcast series with TNC Colorado, we've highlighted both the breadth and depth of the organization's work in Colorado and beyond. From grasslands conservation to sustainable water management to forest health to urban conservation efforts and much, much more. It's been amazing to learn about the positive impact that TNC is having across such a broad spectrum of pressing environmental issues. And if you've wondered, as I have, how TNC successfully aligns so many initiatives, teams, and stakeholders towards common organizational goals, well, you're in luck because that's exactly what Paige does. Paige and I sat down at the TNC office in Boulder just before the holidays and had a fun conversation that looked back at some of the 2023 conservation wins and looked forward towards TNC's ambitious goals for the future. We started out talking about Paige's lifelong appreciation for conservation and her career that took her from her home state of Utah to Washington, D.C., and eventually to Colorado. We talked about her skill of thinking strategically while also focusing on the need to get things done, and how she's managed to keep so many balls in the air year after year. We talk about durable conservation, collective action, and embracing risk, and we also talk about the challenges and opportunities that come with setting ambitious goals. Paige is a voracious reader and a lover of history, so she has tons of excellent book recommendations. A big thank you to Paige for taking time to chat with me during such a busy time of year, and once again, thank you for listening. Hope you enjoy. All right, Paige, thank you for taking the time to talk with me. We had to reschedule because of family stuff, which you definitely understand, or weather-related school closures, and you were so nice to reschedule. But here we are in Boulder, end of the year, which is super exciting. And I just sent out in my good news email a week or two ago a link to TNC Colorado's year-end review for 2023. And so that's one of the occasions for us talking, is to just kind of talk about how the year ended up, kind of recap a lot of things. But we've met before, but it's funny because a lot of the people in the conservation world, I've run into them and I know a decent amount, but I don't know that much about you personally. And so I know you're from Utah, which is cool. And so I'd love to hear, to start out just with, like, how did you end up doing this work? Like where'd you grow up? How did outdoors, wide open spaces, conservation become a part of your kind of mission in life?
Yeah, great. Happy to talk about that. And first, I just want to thank you for this really fun and partnership that we've had over 2023. It's been really great for us to be able to share our work with your listeners, but also to discover, other Westerners and other people doing exciting things in conservation and beyond across the West. So really appreciate the partnership and happy to be here to do the year-end summary to close this out. Hopefully there will be more to come.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So I grew up in northern Utah in a place called Providence.
Yep.
It's part of something called the Cache Valley, which is at the very northern part of the state up by the Idaho border. And it's a really beautiful and special place. It's a little quirky sometimes, but it is also a really beautiful and special place because it's an agricultural valley that is surrounded on both sides by mountains. So you have the Bear River mountain range to the east, and we have the Wellsville mountain range to the west. Agricultural valley is kind of cross-cut by streams in the middle, so, really a special place to grow up. And I feel like I grew up, as many people in my generation did, having a lot of access to undeveloped, open, natural areas. And so that was part of how I grew up, just running out the door with friends, having the opportunity to play and explore, and having these undeveloped places be kind of the canvas for as much as you wanted to imagine, creating all kinds of worlds. And so, that really, I think, shaped me more than I realized until I got older. And I think a future in conservation was always out there for me, but I took a little bit of a circuitous path to get there.
Me too. I like hearing that.
I was originally had my mind set on being a history professor.
Oh, cool.
I thought I would want to teach college. I was really interested in history, and particularly history of the American West. Yeah. And a field that was relatively new when I was in college is focused on environmental history. And I was struggling a little bit to figure out what I wanted my master's thesis to focus on. And I ended up coming around to this idea of how people are shaped by their experiences in the environment. I read a book that's pretty old now. I think it was actually written in the 70s, was called Topophilia. And it was, really about that, not just how people love the natural world, but how they are actually shaped by their experience and who they are as part of their experiences in the natural world.
Who wrote that book?
It's Yi-Fu Tuan.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm actually
that book has been
pronouncing it correctly, but
okay.
it was a pretty influential book, and definitely influential on me, just for that concept of thinking about who we are is shaped by our experiences in nature and the outdoors. So I ended up doing my master's thesis on a history of Logan Canyon, which was this really beautiful winding canyon near where I grew up. And I interviewed about maybe 13 or 14 octogenarians, sort of people in their 80s who they and their families had a history with this canyon, and who they were as people and how they described themselves and how they thought about their family was really shaped by their experiences with that canyon.
That's cool.
Whether it be, in the sort of late 19th century, their families would go up there to recreate. They would pack up their fancy clothes and their, go up in their wagons up into the canyon and recreate. There were also a lot of people who were sheep herders, or they were part of harvesting timber or minerals from the canyon, or part of the development of a small ski area that's up there. But the title of the thesis was, I just grew up loving the canyon. And they all, really identified who they were based on their experience in nature. And so that, kind of after that, I was interested less in academics and really more in being involved in how natural resources were managed and how the decisions were made and how those places really shaped people, and people subsequently shaped those places.
Well, that's interesting too, thinking about this, series we've been doing over the course of 2023. And I feel like TNC and everybody we've talked to, they're working on such cutting edge conservation work. But at the end, if you boil it down, it's always people are kind of at the common denominator of getting the work done, of dreaming up the work, of collaborating. And so that's interesting that kind of, when you look back, it makes perfect sense. So what was your first job in conservation, like when you decided that you wanted to focus on that?
I didn't have a grand plan for my career. I wanted an experience working in natural resource policy. I looked at a variety of things, and my first job was with the Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Okay.
So the first job I landed was, kind of a early career sort of policy and support position with that agency, and they were focused largely on forestry, but they also had responsibility in state lands and minerals and fire. And so I just, that's how I started my career, was in this forestry space. And after that, I worked in Washington, D.C. for a few years. And, that's a really interesting experience. Worked on forest policy issues, but it's also just a crash course in how the government does and doesn't work, and who's doing the work behind the scenes, and just a really fun, lively place at the time and a great experience.
How was it being in D.C. coming from the West? Because both my wife went to grad school in D.C. and we'd been living out West, and she was in grad school there, and I did a summer internship there. And it was, even though I'm from the East Coast originally, it was quite a shock going from the wide open spaces and arid climate of the West to humid D.C. in the summer. What was that like?
Yeah, it was all of those things because, I grew up in Utah, which is very arid and, not that different geographically from Colorado. And it was really then that I realized how much of a Westerner I am because, we would go hiking, in the woods or that were outside of DC. And I'd be like, when do we get to the top? Yeah. Where's the view?
Yeah.
And it's just different. The trails are a lot more winding, through hardwood forests. And it's just a really different experience. And the humidity, was a really different experience.
It's a swamp.
It is a swamp.
It used to be a swamp, at least.
But it was really so fun.
It's a cool
so
place.
Lively, so much access to different cultural experiences. Riding the metro into work every day was, an international experience.
Sure.
Just because of the variety of people that live there. And it was, really fun and enriching.
And so after your stint in D.C., what was the next step? Back out this way?
I came back out west to help set up an organization that was meant to elevate Western forestry and fire policy priorities and bring together all the state forestry agencies in the West, along with the regional offices of the U.S. Forest Service and also the U.S. Forest Service research stations. So they had kind of been working together informally, and they wanted to have a more powerful voice together to elevate the unique Western forest and fire policy issues. And so I came out west initially to help them develop a coherent policy agenda to talk about things that are unique to the West for those issues, and then ended up helping to set up a whole organization, the Western Forestry Leadership Coalition, that's still in existence and still operating. So that's really fun to see them continue going forward.
I want people that are listening to take note of that because I feel like we were talking before we started recording, there are so many challenges of when you've got a big organization, even though everybody's moving in the same direction, I think it can be hard. It seems like from my perspective on the outside, it can be hard to wrangle all these people to get everybody moving in the right direction. I feel like that's a lot of what you do here at TNC, and I would guess that was great training for that.
Yeah, just reflecting on some of those experiences, a lot of my early career was around collaboration, which wasn't that common an approach then, and so you had at the time people thinking about, spotted owls and, changes in the timber industry and how are we going to bring people together to come up with solutions that everyone can live with, that recognizes livelihoods and environmental concerns, and how do you bring all those different voices to the table and get them to collaborate with each other and think about solutions that enable everyone to win in some way. And so a lot of my early career involved various iterations of bringing different stakeholders and voices to the table, figuring out how to help them find common interests and work towards solutions that could be more durable because, multiple people, whether they be, thinking about their business interests or their, safety of their community or wildlife or whatever, see that coming together, they'll have a more powerful and lasting outcome than they would working individually.
Well, yeah, and that during the spotted owl days, I would just had a historian. You'd be interested in her work, Dr. Sarah Dant. Mm-hmm. She's an environmental historian, and she, in her book, writes a good bit about it's called Losing Eden, writes a bit about that period. That was a hot time, people were fired. So being able to figure out how to make people or help people figure out a way to collaborate during that time. I mean, that's like PhD level in collaboration. And so how did you end up at TNC?
Yeah, so I was introduced to TNC actually by my dad.
Oh, cool.
He's been a member of TNC for probably 30 plus years.
Neat.
And I think he was just really drawn to the Nature Conservancy as this very pragmatic conservation organization, which at the time they put their money where their mouth was. They were out there purchasing, really important lands and protecting them, and not really getting so involved in sort of politics or controversy, but just really practically going forward, doing this land protection work. And so, just through him getting the magazine and, reading the newsletters and the fact that he had so much respect for them just kind of created a foundation of interest and respect in me for this organization. And then I was able to work with TNC folks, in DC. I met some folks from the Nature Conservancy, and then working west-wide, and particularly in Colorado. So after I worked for that west-wide organization, I came to the Colorado State Forest Service.
Okay.
And so I was working on forest and fire issues in Colorado, still with a west-wide focus, but mostly in Colorado, and had the opportunity to work pretty closely with folks from the Nature Conservancy as they were just beginning to get into thinking about forest and fire, and thinking not just about places that we wanted to protect, but, how do you need to influence the management of these larger landscapes, including public lands? And they were thinking about forests and fire. And when I was at the state, we worked together with folks from the Nature Conservancy and a variety of other organizations to create something called the Front Range Roundtable that was a really early collaborative focused on how do we deal with fires like the Hayman Fire, which happened in 2002, was really a wake-up call for people that we were starting to see fires move at a scale and intensity that we hadn't seen before. And that really galvanized stakeholders coming together. And that was really, how I started working with folks from the Nature Conservancy when I was a state employee, and building a collaborative to think about what is the science, how do we need to think about issues like biomass? What are the policy solutions that will enable us to get to a better scale of forest management on the Front Range and help us, combat what we were seeing at the time as increasingly large and fast-moving fires.
Well, and I've just learned so much through this partnership. Rob Addington, who we just saw out here before we hit the record button, that episode, if people want to learn a lot of detail about everything Colorado TNC is doing in forest health, forest management and fire, that's interesting. And then I had a recent podcast with an author named John Valiant, who wrote a book called Fire Weather, and he talks about right around the year 2001, fires started doing things that they'd never done before in recorded history or ever. So anyway, as is the case, this is a very selfish project because I'm just learning all this cool stuff. So in your current role here at TNC, how do you describe it? Because I feel like you do a lot. And you have a lot of, and a lot of it is behind the scenes, and a lot of it is getting, all the stuff that you've been talking about, figuring out ways to get everybody moving in the same direction, identify priorities, it's one thing to sit around and come up with great ideas. It's another thing to execute on the ideas, and you do both, which is I'm always amazed with. How do you describe your job now?
My current job is as Deputy State Director and Director of Conservation. And
that sounds like two jobs to me.
You might think that. Yeah. And just to say how I got here, so I came to TNC to lead our forest and fire program in a role very similar to the one that Rob has now, and is just, doing an incredible job in. And after working with forest and fire for so long, I really became interested in the nexus between all the different areas of conservation, because I was thinking about forests are intimately connected to the health of watersheds and rivers, also thinking about the connection to climate change and biodiversity and, even to cities. And I really wanted to work at that level where I wasn't just thinking about one aspect of conservation, but thinking about many. So when this job came available, I was like, that looks like the opportunity to really wade into what it looks to think about the interconnections between, ecosystems and conservation and people. And it definitely is all of those things. It's a challenging and exciting and really rewarding job. And it is really thinking about not the specifics of any individual area of work, but how do we always be looking for the interconnections? How do we advance this work in a way that's more than the sum of the parts? And so, I'm looking across all of the different programs. So thinking about forests and water and, cities and climate and land protection, and saying, how do I make sure that the people doing this work are connected with each other? So there's a lot of building connectivity among people across the team, and then also connecting with the larger organization.
Yes.
How do we make sure that we know what's happening across the West or in North America or even globally, and how that is relevant to what we're doing in Colorado? Because TNC Colorado in particular has always been really interested in working beyond our borders. So when I first came to the Nature Conservancy, we were in the process of helping to launch the multi-state Colorado River program. And I know you spoke with Taylor Haas. We were also in the process of helping to set up an international program in Mongolia.
Oh, wow.
Because there was a lot of similarity between the grasslands in Colorado and the grasslands in Mongolia. And so we were kind of the sponsor of helping to launch this international program. And then, of course, we also have our Southern High Plains work, which is a multi-state effort. So I think that's just part of our DNA at TNC Colorado, to be thinking about what's relevant and important in Colorado, making sure that we're doing the most that we can to benefit here, but then also always looking at what is the larger benefit. How can we leverage the work we're doing here to have benefit beyond our borders? And so that's part of what I'm thinking about, along with just the basic well-being of our folks. They are passionate, they're hard workers. Working in conservation can be challenging.
Yeah.
There's some scary futures out there. And so it's thinking about the work itself, but also the people doing the work and making sure that they have what they need to be successful and supporting them.
So when I hear that, thankfully through this series over the course of 2023, I've gotten to know so many different people within the organization that I didn't know, first of all, and I didn't, to be honest, I didn't even know there was that area of expertise. And it's just the breadth and the depth of everything y'all do. It has been inspiring to me. But I feel like you take any sizable company, nonprofit, for-profit, whatever, government, and people would say the same thing you said, like they want their people to work together. They don't want there to be silos. They want to take care of the people. But very few organizations actually deliver on that. And so, but y'all deliver on that. I'd love to hear, the bad question would be, how do you do that? What's the secret? But I think maybe a more specific question would be, can you give me an example of something you're proud of during your tenure here where you were able to kind of break down those silos and figure out a way for two former silos to kind of merge together in the right ways to make change happen? Does anything come to mind as an example of something you've done like that? I feel like when I was talking to Rob in all the materials I was preparing with, it made it pretty clear that there was a pretty good link between your fire program and your water program. Mm-hmm. But has it always been that way?
So when I started with the Nature Conservancy working in forest and fire, we did have a team working on freshwater, and they were very focused on increasing flows in rivers to support critical values. Particularly, fish and wildlife habitat, but also, recreation and just the general health of those riparian ecosystems. And on the forest side, we were working, more in the upper elevations, thinking about forest restoration in ponderosa pine and mixed conifer systems. And we recognized that was part of the watershed, the work in the forest, but we just didn't work together because the freshwater teams, were not really at that time focused on making that connection. They were really focused on what is the condition in the river, the wet water in the river. But over time, I think the work has really come together. And I think, part of my role in this position has just been really encouraging folks like Rob and Diana, both of whom you spoke to explore where their work intersects and to be open to thinking about, are there ways that we could pursue this work that are more synergistic, where we can accomplish multiple benefits, through similar projects. And so that really is coming together. I think you heard about some of this where we're thinking about process-based restoration. So this, using low-tech structures to mimic the work of beavers. It can achieve restoring riparian areas that can serve as fire breaks and also serve as, important riparian habitat. So just looking at bringing together the work of our forest teams and our water teams on this kind of watershed resilience and restoration, particularly in the face of climate. How do we make these systems more resilient so that they improve the function of the watershed, but also help us better be resilient in the face of wildfire?
The work that you all are doing, I think the results kind of speak for themselves. But then I think one of the things that I've always been impressed with, and even more so over this year, is your ability to tell the story, like in the marketing material and the websites and that kind of thing. You can tell these complicated stories in an engaging way that I feel like that's one thing that's always been kind of missing in a lot of conservation, particularly like private lands conservation groups, is they don't know how to make it exciting, or they don't know how to make it relevant for the average person who cares about it. And the next thing you know, people are talking about water rights and consumptive use, and I'm falling asleep. Whereas I feel like y'all have figured out a way to get the word out in a way that engages people, which I think is so important. But I don't know, I'm kind of biased in that. So fast forwarding, or not really fast forwarding, but thinking about today. So it's the end of December 2023. I can't believe that. I feel like we just started this thing, but wrapping up the year as and there's actually it's community day here, I think is what you called it. And so the whole staff's here today, and y'all are kind of reflecting on the year. What are you most proud of over the course of this year that y'all that you've either accomplished or you've set the stage to accomplish in future years? I mean, what's got you excited as you think back on the past 11 and a half months?
Yeah, so actually I appreciated the opportunity to prepare for this conversation because it gave me a chance to really reflect on those things.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
Because I think, we're always so busy moving forward that we don't take that time to reflect, and it is so important to do that. And there were several things that came to mind. I think you touched on many of the things that were important accomplishments for us over the year through your conversations, but I still want to highlight a few of those.
Yeah.
One thing that I think you didn't have an opportunity to cover through the conversations that we set up with you is our work on renewable energy siting. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is that my colleagues on our climate team have been working with a coalition of other organizations to think about how we could set up a policy framework for the state of Colorado that would incentivize renewable energy siting that takes into consideration the priorities of conservation and communities, along with really accelerating the pace of renewable energy build out the way that we need to in order to meet our climate mitigation and emission reduction goals. And so this group of folks has been holding a whole range of conversations with a variety of stakeholders, county commissioners, agriculture, recreation, all kinds of different interests, thinking about what would it take to build a coalition of support around this kind of policy framework for conservation and community-aligned renewable energy siting. They recently held a summit. Now they're starting to do the hard work of thinking about legislative concepts. But I'm just really excited about the progress that we've been able to make because that's one of those critical issues. We know that we need to make this transition to renewable energy for the sake of climate, but we also don't want to sacrifice all of the intact landscapes, the places that are important for habitat, places that are important for communities in the process of doing that. Okay. The Nature Conservancy has done an analysis across the Western United States and has shown through modeling that it's possible to do the renewable energy build out that we need in order to make that transition while also taking into consideration how we can minimize negative impacts to particularly conservation. And so we're really excited about moving this potential pathway and policy framework forward in Colorado.
And so the first one of these episodes we did was with Carlos, and we talked a lot about the strategic plan and how that was guiding a lot of the action and the planning and this very, very, very bold goals. And I think, we spoke, we had one podcast conversation about the Catalyst Fund where you're purposefully taking risk and trying stuff because you kind of have to if you're going to be achieving these goals. What's kind of given you, what's exciting and or daunting or kind of energizing you in a good way about the strategic plan now that you're 11 and a half months farther along towards that? Is it 2030 is the kind of...
Well, our current strategic plan is actually planned through 2026.
Okay,
so we're actually about a little over halfway through. And I think we are starting to see those points where, we've gone beyond just exploring the initial ideas to the strategic plan to seeing some things come to fruition. And so that has been really great. Another example is getting to construction on the Maybell irrigation ditch diversion rehabilitation project. So that was we had planned that early on. It took several years to bring together all the complicated federal funding to make it happen and to get the engineering design in place. But we actually broke ground or under construction now, which is really exciting. And then I think some other things you also heard, I'm sure Rob highlighted the launch of this Western Dry Forest and Fire initiative, which is something the Nature Conservancy is doing on a West-wide basis to really try to get at that challenge of how do we get to scale? How do we accelerate forest restoration at the pace that we need to, kind of combat and ensure forests and communities are resilient in the face of fires that we're seeing today? Some other exciting things that have happened related to the strategic plan and what we had hoped. You heard from Chris Hawkins on our cities work. I think the huge investments, $22 million in urban and community forestry funding coming to the state of Colorado to work on, in particular, what we're interested in, more equitable urban tree canopy that helps communities combat, the climate-driven urban heat and also makes their communities nicer places, healthier places to live. I believe about 11 million of that will come to the Denver metro area, which is where we have been working with local communities and are excited to see that, that's an enabling condition to really scale up some of that work. Another thing I'm excited to see how it plays out is the Colorado Outdoor Plan. I don't know if you've heard about this. This is something GOCO is sponsoring in partnership with the Department of Natural Resources. And we've been able to participate in particularly bringing our resilient and connected network analysis, which, provides some of that biodiversity and habitat connectivity piece. And there's also a big focus on climate, recreation, conservation overall. And it's this evolving vision for, how Colorado can take a more proactive approach to ensuring that these important places remain and are accessible. So that's just a few things that are coming to fruition that we had envisioned in our original strategic plan. And the last couple of things I'll highlight that I'm really excited about. We just brought on our first tribal and indigenous engagement program manager, Isabella Rufino, who we're really excited to have on board to help us further advance the goals that we set out in our strategic plan with regard to supporting Indigenous-led conservation and priorities. And we also launched a new fellowship program this year in partnership with Great Outdoors Colorado. We were able to bring on 3 early career fellows to, from a wide variety of backgrounds to help them, get to know what a career in conservation might look like and get experience. And we're learning so much from them. It's just been a great experience already.
There's so much going on there. And I think I asked Carlos this, and but how do you manage all of this in your head? How do you know what to prioritize? Because you've only got so much time, even if you only slept like 4 hours a night. You got a family, you got a kid, you got hobbies. You look like you're well rested. You don't look like. Just take Nature Conservancy out. You as a professional, how do you manage all this stuff? Because I need some career advice because like I just need to put out these podcasts and I need to write some stuff. And I feel like it's overwhelming to me. And when you list all that, I don't understand how a person can do that. Like what's your process for keeping all the balls in the air?
I'm fortunate to have a lot of great colleagues. And so, a lot of a role like mine is understanding, the strengths of all of the people that you're working with and, finding ways to enable them to be successful. And so it is a lot to hold in your head. And, sometimes it does feel overwhelming, but I do feel fortunate to work at a place like the Nature Conservancy because we do put a lot of emphasis on trying to maintain that work-life balance. And also because the people I work with, are so amazing, so talented, so dedicated. And sometimes my role is helping them make sure that they take the breaks that they need, that they keep themselves healthy. Yeah, I think I'm really interested in thinking about how things work as systems. And so I think this complexity does appeal to me in some ways. I think not everyone likes that. We also have a lot of doers, who really just want to get out there and do the things. And, that's awesome because they get a lot of really amazing things done. I do also really like thinking about the connections and the systems and, how I can help to bring all of the pieces together.
Do you have specific time where you put on your calendar, no meetings, no email, nothing, and you can just think?
Not enough.
Carlos, if you're listening, we need to make sure.
Yeah.
I mean, but that just, because I feel like that's one of the biggest things nowadays is just the constant, maybe this distractions, maybe it's work. I don't know. I think most of it's distraction, but these constant Slack, email, whatever coming in. And I feel like for a role like you have, there is a requirement to be able to think deeply on things. And I bet that's hard to find.
It is hard to, I mean, it's on me really, like to carve out that time and, to put the importance on that. And so I need to be better about that. I think it does bring to mind though, you had asked me previously, just thinking about challenges, what challenges we face. And I think we're in this place in the conservation field where there are not any easy wins left.
Yes.
The challenges that we face are all hard and there's no easy answers. And so we live in this place where we hold a lot of dilemmas that we just have to manage our way through. And I think one of those is around urgency, the urgency to get as much done as quickly as possible because the challenges we face are large and fast moving. At the same time, we know that to have durable outcomes, we need to build trust. We need to work with local communities. We need to, take the time to build, those relationships. And so how do you manage through dealing with urgency, moving as quickly as you need to, but also being thoughtful about relationships and trust and partners? And so I think it's just trying to get ourselves comfortable with holding that both of those things are true. And how do we find our way through that? Yeah.
Well, and it seems like the ground is shifting underneath you as far as climate change goes. I just did an event down in Texas with some of the folks there were actually people on the panel that wrote the Endangered Species Act, and there were people that are now in charge of implementing it. And one of the things they were saying is that it's going to become more and more of an issue, the Endangered Species Act, because there are going to be so many more endangered species because of climate change. And it was interesting being in that room because if I ever get negative feedback on this podcast, it's people saying that I talk too much about climate change. But yet we had this room full of people of all political persuasions, and they all agreed that the climate's changing. I feel like that whatever the issues are now, in 10 years, they're going to be completely different. Like you think about 1990 versus 2010 when it comes to fire.
In 5 years, it might be different.
In 5 years, it might be different. So that's That's a whole different thing. You mentioned the term durable, and I feel like that's a word or a term. I hear durable conservation come up a lot. Can you talk more about that, what that means to you and the importance of durable conservation?
Yes. So we think about that a lot in how long does the conservation benefit last? So I think originally one of the things that was so attractive about buying and protecting land is that it felt very permanent, like you were permanently protecting that place. Now, in the face of climate change, what we're learning is that, as ecosystems and habitats and things are shifting, those places we originally protected may not have been as durable as we thought. But as we have shifted beyond land protection into things like trying to improve management, if we're thinking about improving forest conditions, for example, you might do, one management treatment, but if you don't go back and maintain that, follow up with prescribed fire, go back within, 15 or 20 years to maintain that, the durability of your conservation outcome is more limited. And I think also we think about this a lot in terms of people. So if we, as the Nature Conservancy, come in and demonstrate a different way to manage your grazing lands, for example, but we haven't built support and buy-in, we haven't made sure that that was something that actually works for people for whom that is their livelihood, then we're not going to have a durable conservation outcome. So a lot of it is around building those foundations of trust, making sure that what we're doing makes sense for the people that really need to implement it, on a broader scale across the landscape. We won't have a durable outcome if we don't do those things.
Again, I mean, I sound like a broken record on this, but the people aspect and the relationship aspect, and that was one of the first things I ever noticed about TNC when I was in the real estate business, and I got to know Matt Moorhead, who was on one of the previous episodes, and he'd been out there at that point in eastern Colorado for 15, 16 years building these relationships. And if you looked at the number of acres conserved over that time, it was, slow, and then kind of hockey stick. And I think it's because of those relationships, and that's just one of many examples of that throughout the organization. But there's no getting around the people. And then there's another term I wanted to ask you about that I've heard a lot, and I feel like you're an expert in this, is collective action. That's one of these buzzwords that I hear people say, and it's like in business school, some people say these buzzwords, and it's easy to say it, it's nothing to do it. And so how do you talk about collective action and how that concept kind of shapes what you do?
I'll give you my interpretation
Please.
of collective action. I'm sure there's a lot more professional definitions, but when I think about collective action, as you mentioned, we at the Nature Conservancy have been thinking about partnership for a long time. Everything we do, all of those successes that, I rattled off for you, those are all partnership efforts. Not a single one of those is something that we did as TNC alone. We did all of those things with others. But when I think about collective action, I think of that being a different scale. So it's not just partnership around a specific project or something that you might be doing, but really thinking about how do you galvanize action by a number of different people to have a significantly exponentially larger outcome. And so I think our new Western Dry Forest and Fire initiative is an example of trying to get at that scale. The Nature Conservancy in many of these Western states has been working in deep partnership with a wide range of people to try to change the trajectory of forest management, increase the pace and scale. But we're not getting to the impact that we want to see working state by state, program by program. And so the experiment with this new initiative is what happens if we join forces across multiple states and we try to change the way the Nature Conservancy is working with partners at this really big scale.
Yeah.
Can we have an impact that's meeting the scale of the challenge we face by working in this different way? And so I feel like collective action is about also thinking about the underlying kind of social structures and political structures and, how do you need to change the system by working together, all pulling towards, a particular outcome.
It seems like with a lot of these initiatives, there's a collaboration period, a research period, getting to know people, period. Like I can only imagine getting all these different fire organizations into the same room. But like, how do you know when you've done enough of the talking and enough of the research and enough of the relationship building and all the very, very, very important stuff, and then converting that into actually taking action? Because I feel like there's a lot of nonprofit organizations that are real good, and for-profit, real good at talking. And that's kind of the fun part in a way. But then when the rubber hits the road, it's like, is this going to work or not? And I've seen that happen so many times where there's all this talking and planning and big ideas and fundraising. And then when it comes to make things happen, that's tough. So like over your career, how have you figured out that kind of that sweet spot, that transition spot? Or maybe it isn't a transition. Maybe it's just you add action to it. But like, how do you know when to actually get things done? I mean, how do you know when it's the right time?
I think it differs by what the situation is. In the forest space, I think that we invested some time, with that Front Range Roundtable group to bring scientists together, and having scientific agreement was a really important enabling condition at the time because people just didn't agree on what you should be doing in the forest to pursue forest restoration. But I think there is a lot to be said for just learning by doing.
Yes.
Making sure that you have enough of a foundation that you're not just, going out there and implementing something that could be ineffective or at the worst case harmful. So I think you definitely want to ground that. But I think, and I've come around to this, I think as my career has progressed, that there's just a lot of power in learning by doing. And so if you can take some funding, for example, and just incentivize trying some things, at a smaller scale, bringing people together, allowing them to have some success together. I think the Southern High Plains program is a really good example of how that kind of investment built real momentum and enthusiasm over time that has enabled that body of work to grow, and particularly bring in participants from other states, colleagues from other states that might have been doubtful about whether that might work. Yep. I think just going out and doing things, doing a land protection project, helping to catalyze a land protection project in New Mexico and in Kansas and, most recently in Texas. And we're thinking about one in Oklahoma, and just helping to say, look, this is what this can look like. We can help, work through barriers that you might have thought were there originally. And so I think, with these kinds of collaborations, you have to sort of feel out the partners that you're working with. Sometimes there will be a really unique opportunity, an investment of funding that comes along that really catalyzes moving to action. But sometimes it just takes being willing to step out, and put something on the ground and learn from it and see how it goes.
Well, and that brings me to another topic that's come up time and again, is the idea of taking risks and being willing to take risks. And I would guess, maybe I'm wrong, but when you were, working at governmental organizations, they're, more times than not very risk averse. And then I feel like a lot of times big organizations that are established, and TNC is, very well established and very big and broad, they can slowly stop wanting to take risks and or rock the boat in any way. But it seems that risk taking, if anything, it seems that it's becoming more of a focus, and controlled risk taking as much as you can. But how has risk, or the TNC's approach to risk, changed, if at all, during your tenure? I mean, is that something that's been more of a focus? Like we got to take risks.
It's changed a lot
because it speaks to the thing you were talking about all the easy wins. The easy stuff is done.
And I think it goes back to what you're saying about climate change too, and just the rapid pace at which both the social and the natural environment are changing. And so it's gone from where, we could design a 5-year strategic plan and just kind of methodically work through what we outlined, to where we need to have more of just a structure that guides us, but then have more adaptability to continue to learn and change our strategies based on changing conditions. And I do think our interest in and willingness to take risks has changed a lot over time. I think the Nature Conservancy is not inherently risk-taking organization. I mean, it's a very ambitious organization, but I think we here in Colorado have deliberately been trying to cultivate a higher risk tolerance and more focus on innovation and adaptation and learning. And that's why we started the Catalyst Fund, was just to put that on the ground, and knowing it wasn't going to be perfect the first time we tried it, but inviting colleagues to come up with ideas that they wanted to test and investing in that kind of innovation. And now we're taking that to a next level, developing a larger innovation strategy that will ideally allow us both to continue investing in innovative ideas internally, but also starting to, look externally and invite others to collaborate with us in coming up with innovative responses to hard problems. And we know that they won't all be successful. And it's, getting comfortable with that idea that not everything's going to work. Not everything will be perfect. Some things might fail, but as long as we take advantage of that learning opportunity every time, it's continuing to move us forward and will help us get to the solutions we need more quickly.
One of the reasons I started this podcast is because I think about myself when I was 23 years old and I was working at Merrill Lynch and, thought I was kind of following the path you're supposed to follow, but pretty quickly I just realized it wasn't as fulfilling as I hoped. And so I had this dream of, well, how do you start doing cool work? What are these people looking for? And so, I know when you think about everybody that is even in this building where we are right now, there's very, very specialized scientists, and then there's relationship builders, and there's just kind of this broad range of specific skills. But when you're talking about everything you manage and how you've got this great team, I feel like it all starts with hiring. And y'all have figured out, you and the rest of the team here have figured out how to hire really good people that can learn and grow and get better at what they do. But there must be some core value across the board, whether you're talking about a very specialized scientist or a relationship builder, full spectrum. Are there any kind of core principles or core qualities that you look for as that would make a good team member at TNC? And then that can be, I feel like that can apply to anybody who wants to get in conservation anywhere, not necessarily TNC, but what are you looking for in people?
Well, first I want to just jump on something that you said, because it's something I really want to highlight, which is that it takes so many different kinds of people and skill sets to drive conservation and make it successful. And I think, through this series of podcasts, you've been able to highlight a lot of the specialized conservation work that we're doing and, heard from a lot of the experts. But there are so many people also behind the scenes that don't get the spotlight. And just like you said, there are people who help us tell amazing, compelling stories, people who help us bring in all of the resources we need to do this work, people that help us manage our budgets and do complex grant agreements. And, we have legal teams and people who know how to run drones and, along with the scientists and land managers. And so I just think it's really important to emphasize that there is a pathway to a career in conservation, almost regardless of what you're interested in. And I actually gave a presentation along those lines at my son's middle school, which was really interesting. They had a career day, and I was like, well, I don't want to talk about one specific career. And so my whole presentation was, what are you interested in? There's a way that you could take that interest and benefit the planet and conservation. And I just think that is so important. And so when we hire, I do think our hiring processes have changed over time to where we're looking, we certainly still need people with very specialized sets of skills. So, depending on the position, we are looking at that. But more and more, we're looking at, can people work as a team? Are they flexible? Do they bring a range of diverse perspectives to, enhance the kinds of conversations and ideas and work that we can do? And, more and more, we're really looking to bring in to make sure that our team represents the diversity in Colorado itself and beyond.
Yep.
And, So really looking at different kinds of qualities about how people work. Do they value relationships? Do they value teamwork, collaboration? Can they be flexible and adaptive? So those kinds of things we're looking at in our hiring processes more and more.
When it shows through, whether it's the people I've spoken to when we recorded it or all the other team members that are not being recorded. I mean, I think that ability to get along with people, the curiosity. I interviewed this guy a while back, and he was the guitarist for the country superstar named Chris Stapleton. Mm-hmm. And I asked him, what are they, when you were applying for the job, if that's, what was he looking for? And the guy said, they never even asked me or cared one bit about my guitar skills. It was all the other kind of intangibles, like, are you responsible? Are you going to show up to work on time? Are you the kind of guy we want to go on tour with? Because the guitar is kind of a given. And so I think I feel like there's a version of that. There are all these intangibles that y'all have nailed somehow. I was going to say, don't give your secret to some of these big corporations, but it might be better off if you did, because it's very impressive. You strike me as somebody very curious who thinks very deeply on a lot of things. I wish I could think as deeply as you do. My brain's all just crazy. I'd love to hear books that have been influential to you, both if there are any books about the West or about conservation that have been important, but also any books that have kind of encouraged or helped you figure out a way to think about these big problems, these big complex problems in a way that can lead to action. So, I mean, just let it rip with the books. I feel like you have a lot of good recommendations.
Well, there's been so many. I'm not very good at narrowing down one or two things. I'll just say I'm not one of those people. So there's so many books that have been influential on me. One I was just thinking about the other day that I haven't revisited for a while, but was a book by Patty Limerick. You may know her, who's a professor
I've met her
at
before,
CU.
yeah.
In the kind of late 80s, she wrote a book called Legacy of Conquest.
Yep.
That was one of the early kind of reinterpretations about the history of the American West and how it wasn't quite as romantic as we've been led to believe, and was quite unromantic and businesslike in many ways.
Yes.
So, that was an influential book when I was in graduate school and thinking about the history of the West and the environment and, what the stories really were that shaped this place where I had grown up. More recently, I just finished a book called Fire on the Plateau that was written by Charles Wilkinson, very influential.
He just passed away,
He just passed away, yes, very influential law professor and leader at CU Boulder and a longtime advocate for Native American rights,
yes,
advocating on behalf of tribes. And this Fire on the Plateau was recommended to me by a colleague, and it really it's part memoir, part his experience with the Colorado Plateau region over about 30 years, but then also highlighting just the intersections of people there, including the indigenous communities and what the, extremely negative impacts on them were of settlement, but then also their fight over time, particularly in the 20th century, to reestablish their rights to natural resources. It's a really powerful book, really enjoyed it. I just started one that I actually brought with me so I could look at, called The Rediscovery of America by Ned Blackhawk, who's a Yale...
Yeah, I met him at the same thing where I met Patty Limerick.
Oh, great.
Yeah. I've actually thought that he'd be really cool to get on the podcast. I didn't know he had a new book.
Yeah, it's really, I'm just a little bit ways into it, but it's really interesting. And, another, I think, since Patty wrote her book, the people have been peeling back the layers much more about, the history of the West and all the aspects. This one is particularly focused on, indigenous history and, really bringing in more of the complexity that was involved. And then just because, and you can even cut this out, but I also read a lot of fiction.
Oh, that's great. And, I need to read more fiction.
I had the opportunity to do a bucket list trip to Sweden
over
the summer, which was really awesome. So I've been reading a lot of Swedish authors, but someone I really like is Fredrik Backman. People may know him from a book called A Man Called Uva.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
And they made a Tom Hanks, I think, film of it they changed the name. But I just really love his series of books because they they just have a really kind of funny but really poignant way of talking about people's relationships with each other and, intergenerational. And one that I really liked that I read recently is called My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry.
Really?
My grandmother asked me to tell you she's sorry. And it's just about these different generations of women and all of these people that live together in an apartment building, and how what you see on the surface of any one of them, what we see on the surface of, anyone around us is so much more complicated underneath.
Yes.
So for fiction readers, I really love his books.
That's great. And I say this all the time, and I've been saying it for almost 8 years on this podcast, and I have not taken action, is I need to read more fiction, And I feel like reading more fiction, for me, whenever I do read a really great novel, I feel like it helps my writing. I feel like it helps my way of thinking about things. I think you can really nail home these big ideas and big concepts that you're so good at, in a much more powerful way than you can if you're just telling somebody how to do it or whatever instruction manual.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to what you were saying about story, the power of delivering a message or thinking through an experience or processing, an experience through story. I think that's what good fiction can do.
Any other novelists that come to mind that you like while you're thinking about it?
Well, one I'm sure you've heard, one of my favorite novelists that I always go back to is Barbara Kingsolver.
She's got a new book out, I think.
She does. And she has one called Demon Copperhead.
My wife's reading that right now.
Which is, it's a different kind of book than a lot of her earlier books, which I was drawn to. Very good, but more dark.
I've seen her her name has popped up on different podcasts that I listen to, and so I figured she had a new book. The only one I've read, obviously, is the nonfiction one, Animal, Vegetable, Miracle,
right? Which
was really good. She's amazing. I'm amazed by novelists.
She is amazing. Yeah, and she's written so many. She's written poetry and novels and nonfiction, and I think that's the ability to write in all of those different venues, I think, says a lot to her.
Yeah. She's a pro. So last question for you. We're at the end of the year. You've been, accomplished so much, yet there's so much more to go, and so much more that we don't even know about at this point, as things are changing, and we'll be sitting here at the end of 2024 and have a whole new set of things that may need to be addressed. But any kind of parting words of wisdom, anything you'd like to ask of the listeners, any kind of way you'd like to wrap things up?
Well, this may be advice to myself as much as to everyone, but I think it's really valuable. And that is just to take time to get outside, to spend time in nature, whether it's the park close to home, whether it's getting up into the mountains, spending time on the river. Every time I do that, it's just so restorative and, affirming about why it's important to be doing this work. And it helps to re-energize, I think, to keep going in the future. And I would also say, get outside and take a young person with you, because I think it's so important that the younger generation, the kids my son's age and your daughter's age, that they really see nature as an intrinsic part of their well-being and something that they're willing to advocate for and work on behalf of. The planet needs that, conservation needs that. So get outside, remember why nature is so important, and take a kid with you.
I love it. I think that's, we ought to make a t-shirt that says that. Paige, you're the best. This is so great, so inspiring. Thank you so much. And I'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for this partnership over the year.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do. including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.